Hello and welcome to our TrainDL WebTalk, in which we're going to discuss the opportunities and challenges of policy experimentation projects in the context of digital education. My name is Elisabeth Schauermann. I'm leading the team Society and International Affairs at the German Informatics Society, and I'm very happy to moderate this event. I'm supported by my colleagues Anna Liegfeld, who is the TrainDL coordinator, and Rika Bak. This talk is being recorded, and we encourage you to contribute your questions and contributions in the chat. But TrainDL, you might ask, which you also see on the slide. So before we jump in to the topic, let me briefly introduce you to some of the main features and questions of the project on the basis of which we want to frame today's conversation. TrainDL is an acronym for teacher training for data literacy and computer science competences. And the consortium with partners in Germany, Austria, and Lithuania aims to embed educational concepts for data literacy and artificial intelligence into teacher training. It is a central goal of ours to provide evidence-based recommendations to implement these skills in curricula and educational systems all over Europe. The project activities also develop materials for teacher training, in particular for teachers of different school levels and subjects, not only computer science. For this purpose, policy experimentation approach is being used, in which we test the effectiveness and efficiency of educational interventions. How that plays out in TrainDL specifically and more broadly is what we're going to discuss in the next 70 minutes. Our project is funded by the European Union through the Erasmus program, and we started our activities in 2021, which means we have just entered our final project year with a lot of exciting field trials coming up and findings when we look into how to best train teachers who are teaching STEM subjects in secondary school, and we also work with primary school educators. You can find more on our website, train-dl.eu. I will put the link in the chat, or one of my colleagues might in a second, so you can check that out later. And in the project, we are constantly building our understanding of what policy experimentation means and how we can best design our processes and outcomes so that they are relevant for policymakers, especially in the education field, when it comes to these emerging topics or already very much emerged topics, data and AI. Today's conversation is a next step in our knowledge journey, and we hope that this is fruitful for everyone watching as well. We have a panel of excellent guests. Most of them you can already see. And we are approaching, and they're approaching the topic from different angles and each bring a lot of expertise. So let me briefly introduce them before we jump in. Here with us is Petra Bevek from the Department of Educational Development and Quality at the Slovenian Ministry for Education, Science and Sport. Hi, Petra, nice to have you. Hi,
everybody, nice to be here.
Hi. Next up is Kathrin, who is an officer for Erasmus Plus policy experimentation at the German Academic Exchange Service, the DAAD, which is the national agency for this program in Germany. Hi, Kathrin. As part of the TrainDL consortium, we have Ulrike Lucke here, who coordinates the evaluation in the project and the findings that we have, the evidence for our evidence-based recommendation. Ulrike is a professor at the Department of Computer Science at the University of Potsdam. Nice to have you, Ulrike. And our final guest is Johannes Müller. He's the co-founder and head of data science at the social data science company EndEffect. And he'll also give us our first input on some key concepts of evidence-based policymaking. Hello, Johannes, and the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Elisabeth, and hello, everyone. I'll quickly share my screen. So yeah, I was asked to give a little introduction to evidence-based policymaking, which is not an easy task for only 10 minutes. And we could talk about a lot of different things around evidence-based policymaking. But I thought it might be helpful to start with a quick definition of evidence-based policymaking, and then talk about some misconceptions about the concept, and maybe introduce some concepts along the way. So the definition of, there's not one definition, right, of evidence-based policymaking, but generally speaking, evidence-based policymaking is this notion that policy can be based on empirical and academic evidence. So in the education field, like maybe a naive idea would be we test out a policy or an intervention in one school, we evaluate it properly, and then we roll it out to all schools. Right? I already said that that's a bit of a naive idea of evidence-based policymaking, and I think you'll see why in a second. So let's start with the misconceptions about evidence-based policymaking. I mean, I only grabbed out 4. We could talk about this for a very long time, but maybe to give you a general idea and things I've encountered quite often. So the first misconception is that evidence-based policymaking is relying solely on quantitative data. One core concept in evidence-based policymaking is something called a theory of change. So when we have an intervention or policy, we need some conceptual idea of how this intervention influences some outcomes we want to see. And in the beginning, evidence-based policymaking was very heavily influenced from evidence-based medicine, where we have something, for example, like a randomized control trial. And the original idea is to take those methods that we have in medicine and transport it to policymaking. So what it means in practice, like in evidence-based medicine, for example, if you have a drug like aspirin and you want to see if that's actually working, you would have a group of people and you would divide them randomly in 2 groups. The random assignment is very important so that you can basically control for all other factors that might influence the outcome. And then you give one group aspirin and the other group gets a placebo. And then you can measure, for example, the outcome if the temperature, if a fever is reduced in the group that actually received the drug. Right, and this idea we could just take to policymaking, where we have some measurable outcome, randomized groups, and then one group gets the intervention, the other group doesn't or gets a placebo, and then we could compare the outcomes. Right? But there are some problems with that, starting with that, like not all outcomes can be measured. Second one is that often, like, we have much more complex environments we need to evaluate policies in. So there are a lot of like quantitative and qualitative methods that can be used on their own or together in some so-called mixed methods designs to get a better understanding of how a policy or an intervention might have worked. The second misconception is that the goal of evidence-based policymaking is to remove politics from policymaking. And I think that's a very prevalent misconception, that the goal is really to remove any ideology or politics from the decision making. And this is, of course, not possible, and we also don't want that in a democracy. It's a very technocratic idea of policymaking. And there are like some reasons why this will never work. Like, one is that our policymaking process is so complex that you can never detach really the decision making from the political influences. The second one is that there often is conflicting evidence, right? It's not always very clear cut, and all the studies say the same thing, right? So there is some decisions you have to make, even if there is some evidence. And thirdly, research is also not apolitical, right? It matters who does the evaluations. how they're funded. If it's like internal or external evaluations, there are many things to consider. So yes, policymaking can never be apolitical, and the goal of evidence-based policymaking is not to remove politics from it. Third misconception is that evidence-based policymaking is not feasible in complex policy areas. I think the example I mentioned in the beginning with an aspirin, that's a very clear-cut example, right? You have a very clear intervention, and you can directly measure the outcome. Policies are often not that targeted, and the causal effects are not that immediate if they appear. So complexity is, I think, a huge challenge in policy evaluation, because your goal is often to identify this causal effect that your intervention has. But we have so many influences, right? So it might be very hard to identify really the contribution of your intervention to an outcome. And in some areas, it might really not be possible to evaluate it coherently, right, and get like a definite answer. But maybe to give one example of where evaluation works in a complex area is one of my favorite policy evaluations. I have a list of my favorite policy evaluations. That's one, and there was an evaluation in Medellin in the early 2000s, and in the 90s there was a very high like violence rate, the factions fighting, so a very bad situation in Medellin. And then there was some disarmament of the factions, and it got a lot better in the late 90s. And then in the 2000s, there was an infrastructure policy. They introduced cable cars to connect the neighborhoods on the hills to like the main center that was in the valley. And the idea was that these cable cars can actually contribute to lower violence and lower murder rates. And you would now think that that's quite a stretch, right? Like an infrastructure intervention has an impact on something like the murder rate in Medellin. But they could actually show in the evaluation that it indeed had a causal effect. And how they could measure that was that the decision on which neighborhoods are connected by cable car to city center were chosen at random. So they could compare the neighborhoods that were connected by cable cars to neighborhoods that were in the control group. So this is a research design called a natural experiment. And it was very impressive, the effect size they could show, and also multiple other outcomes that were influenced by this intervention. So there are different methods also when randomized controlled trials, for example, or some more intricate designs are not possible. There are some ways you can evaluate a policy, or maybe you can only evaluate parts of the intervention, right? Where you have like shorter causal chains. So complexity is an issue, but there are things you can do about it. A misconception 4 is that a single evaluation is all you need. So sticking with the example from Medellin, a couple of years later, they implemented a very similar policy in Rio, and it didn't work. Right? One issue was that people were actually not using the public transit as they anticipated in the beginning. And this is, I think, a very valuable lesson in evidence-based policymaking, that when you do one evaluation with one population, it might not be generalizable to other populations or other contexts. So one definition of evidence-based policymaking I really like is finding out what works for whom in what circumstances. It's often called a realist definition of evidence-based policymaking. And to achieve that, one evaluation of an intervention is not enough. You have to do it in different contexts with different populations, and to get a more robust idea of how interventions work and why they work. This is maybe a last point to take with you, that only focusing on intervention outcomes doesn't tell you only so much. So we also have to really look at how interventions worked, what worked, what didn't work, how they were implemented, a whole field of study just about these so-called process evaluations. So to round it out, maybe a quick note on the word itself, evidence-based policymaking. I think especially lately, there's some criticism about the concept itself, because as you heard, like evidence-based policymaking might be more of an ideal type or like a stylized vision in policymaking. So what actually is now more talked about rather than evidence-based policymaking is evidence-informed policymaking, because there are so many different ways that evidence can influence and support policymaking that are not following this ideal definition of evidence-based policymaking. Yes, and with that, I say thank you and hand back to you, Elisabeth.
Thank you, Johannes, and thanks a lot for all these ideas. I can already think of like the different ways that in our own experience, the idealized version and reality interact, and how we move from different target groups. But before we go into our roundtable to maybe talk about some of those things a bit more, we're going to hear more about the objectives and structure of the policy experimentation project as funded by the European Commission in an input by Kathrin Harris. So Kathrin, please go ahead, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Elizabeth, for the kind introduction. My colleague will now share our presentation. Oh, wait a minute. Okay, perfect. Yeah, first of all, I would like to thank the German Informatics Society and the TrainDL Project Consortium for having organized this exciting web talk on this highly relevant topic, which is currently the center of intensive discussion. My name is Kathrin Harris, and I work at the Erasmus Plus National Agency for Higher Education within the German Academic Exchange Service. And together with my colleague Maximilian Seiler, I inform and advise higher education institutions as well as interested institutions from other sectors on funding opportunities for cooperation projects in the Erasmus Plus program. The focus lies on Erasmus Plus policy support projects. One of these projects is the TrainDL project, which is funded under the Erasmus Plus funding line European Policy Experimentations, which I would like to briefly introduce to you in the following. Besides, I'm also responsible for an Erasmus Plus project within the DAAD, which is called Bologna Hub Peer Support 2, and which aims at fostering the implementation of the Bologna reforms at higher education institutions throughout the European higher education area. So even though I do not have any experience myself with experimental projects, I'm quite familiar with the experimental approach and with the management of Erasmus Plus projects. Before we dive deeper into the European policy experimentations, I would like to briefly present the political background of the funding line on the next slide. The member states of the European Union decide on their respective education policies at national or regional level. However, cooperation in the field of education and training between the different member states has increased in recent years. Important strategies have been adopted at European level, and these strategies support the national policies in their efforts to solve existing and future challenges in the field of education and training through transnational cooperation. Therefore, Erasmus Plus projects should always have in mind the following cross-cutting policy contexts: the European education area, the Digital Education Action Plan, which is also probably the most important document in this context, the European Skills Agenda, and the Strategic Framework for Education and Training 2030. These policy documents are important reference points and shape the thematic orientation of the Erasmus Plus program. The so-called transversal priorities of the Erasmus Plus program, which you can see here on the right side, also derive from those policy documents. Under the priority digital transformation, the Erasmus Plus program aims to engage learners, educators, youth workers, young people, and organizations in the path to digital transformation. But let us now have a closer look at the impact of Erasmus Plus policy support projects on the next slides, which will help us to better understand the intention of the experimental approach. The Erasmus Plus program is divided into 3 key actions. Erasmus Plus Key Action 1 supports learning mobility of individuals and therefore operates on an individual level. And in contrast, the other 2 key actions support cooperation projects. Projects under Erasmus Plus Key Action 2 are mainly intended to generate an impact on institutional level. And finally, Erasmus Plus Key Action 3 policy support, to which the European policy experimentations belong, provides support to policy cooperation at European Union level. Thereby, it contributes to the implementation of existing policies and the development of new policies, which can also trigger modernization and reforms. The overarching objective is to achieve impact at a systemic level. Accordingly, the project aimed at improving the framework conditions in which institutions and individuals operate. After this overview, let us have a closer look at the characteristics of the funding line on the next slide. European policy experimentations are transnational cooperation projects that involve testing the relevance, effectiveness, potential impact, and scalability of activities through field trials in different countries. The topics and consequently the activities to be tested may differ from call to call. By combining strategic leadership, methodological soundness, and a strong European dimension, they enable mutual learning and support evidence-based policy at European level. Let us continue with the objectives of the funding line on the next slide. The objectives of European policy experimentations are to promote transnational cooperation and mutual learning among public authorities at the highest institutional level in order to foster systemic improvement and innovation in the education and training fields, to enhance the collection and analysis of substantive evidence, to ensure the successful implementation of innovative measures, and to facilitate the transferability and scalability of effective innovative measures. To achieve these ambitious objectives, the projects often work with stakeholders across different sectors, and in this way, they contribute to an interconnection between higher education institutions on the one side and political stakeholders on the others. Policy support projects are therefore characterized by the fact that a large number of institutions outside the higher education sector participates, and projects are often implemented jointly by civil society organizations, public authorities such as ministries for education and research, business organizations, and institutions from the higher education and school sector. On the next slide, I would like to elaborate on an important process within the European policy experimentations, which is upscaling, and which can be understood as a vertical dissemination of information to policymakers. This includes translating the findings of the project into policy recommendations in order to create an impact at a higher level. There are different tools to implement upscaling. One possibility is to involve policymakers directly during the project in the context of policy talks, for example, and eventually to develop joint documents that can be disseminated at a higher European level. In this context, the process of involving political stakeholders is understood as upscaling. Writing policy recommendations that are handed over to the political actors is also an option to upscale the project. And in the best case, the project is replicated at a higher level or structural adjustments are made based on the project results. Upscaling should not be confused with dissemination. Dissemination describes the spread of information at the horizontal level. The aim is to jointly develop information with other institutions or individuals, as for example, researchers, and to make this information available in a next step. Disseminating information about the project in the media can also be part of a dissemination strategy. After this introduction of the funding line, I would now like to broaden the perspective and give you an overview of other funding possibilities within the Erasmus Plus program on the next slide. The Erasmus Plus projects can be categorized into 3 types of partnerships that vary in terms of ambitions and long-term strategy. Firstly, the partnerships for cooperation. Secondly, the partnerships for innovation. And thirdly, the partnerships for excellence. In the Erasmus Plus program, the sustainability of projects is a key factor. In order to bring positive and long-lasting effects, we encourage project coordinators to further develop their projects once they are completed. Maybe we can see the next slide now. And for example, by submitting an application in another funding line, sometimes more ambitious. Even though I must admit that the European policy experimentations are already one of the most ambitious funding lines. Regarding the development of the funding line, European policy experimentations, we noticed with the last call a shift from partnerships for innovation to partnerships for excellence, but this may change again in the future. For proposals that aim at innovation in and for digital education, the partnerships for innovation might be the most interesting funding opportunity, as for example, the alliances for innovation, the capacity building projects, or the forward-looking projects. Forward-looking projects, for example, aim to identify, develop, test, and/or assess innovative policy approaches that have the potential of improving education and training systems. The objective of the funding line is to foster innovation, creativity, and participation, as well as social entrepreneurship in different fields of education and training. In the last call, there was a priority on digital education, and public authorities, as well as edtech companies, had to be part of the project consortium. The call is published every year with a new Erasmus Plus program guide, and the next call will be published in autumn. On the next slide, I would like to illustrate the sustainable transformation by providing you with some project examples. So I don't know if I have an issue here or if the slides are frozen in.
So I can see a slide that has different projects, I think.
Okay, then it's fine. Okay, perfect. As you can see on this slide, there are several projects that achieve long-lasting effects by further developing their projects from one call to another call. I'm more than happy to have Petra Bevek from the Slovenian Ministry of Education here with us, who participates in the project Virtual Innovation and Support Networks for Teachers, and who will maybe provide us with some insights later on. In addition, there was also a project called OpenU, which stands for Online Pedagogical Resources for European Universities, and which not only the DAAD was part of the consortium, but also the University of Potsdam. And I'm sure that Ulrike Lucke will also share her experiences with us. On the next slide, I would like to briefly present the project A New Way for Talents in Teaching. And this project also addressed an educational policy dimension. It aimed to test an alternative teacher training programs as a policy experiment in several European countries, and I will be happy to share more insights about the project later. But in order to open up the discussion, I included a quote of the project manager, which says, "The exciting thing about European policy experimentations is the integration of our tested measures into policy development." And with these words, I would like to conclude my presentation and just shortly draw your attention to an interesting publication in the context of European policy experimentation on the next slide. This report of the European Commission on support mechanisms for evidence-based policymaking in education describes the mechanisms and practices that support evidence-based policymaking in the education sector in Europe. And it comparatively looks at institutions and practices in evidence-based policymaking, as well as the accessibility and mediation of evidence. The report presents more detailed information on each individual country with specific examples of the use of evidence in policy formulation for each separate country. Then let me conclude my presentation with the next slide. Further information can be found on the website of the German Erasmus Plus National Agency. and on the website of the European Executive Agency for Education and Culture, which manages the European policy experimentations. If you have any questions regarding the application process, or if you would like to discuss your project idea with us, please feel free to contact us or the Erasmus Plus National Agency in your country. Then I would now like to thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion and the exchange with you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kathrin, for giving us a lot of kind of structural insight into how these projects are set out to be. And from what we understood quite early on, and then, as I said, we keep building our understanding, this was really at the center, is that those who provide evidence or who work on evidence and those who can implement change publicly and large scale come together in this project. So I would like to ask you, Petra, from the perspective of a public authority, a ministry, what motivates such an institution as the ministry to participate in these projects, and in your experience, what mindsets or structures need to be in place so that this participation is successful and fruitful?
Hi, everybody again. I would say it's nice to see you, but I can't see absolutely nothing. So everything is dark from my side. I hope you can see me now because even my picture went off.
We can hear you perfectly fine. So.
Perfect.
Sorry.
Thank you. Oh, that's quite okay. Technical issues arise every day. I work in Zoom daily, but it seems that maybe just the web, something not working, whatever. So thank you for having me here, and I'm very happy to participate. I think this is a very on this level a very important talk in regards to what we would like to achieve by participating in Erasmus Plus projects, also from the side of ministries or policy organizations, one way or another. As Kathrin already mentioned before, we are very involved in several projects at this time at the Ministry of Education in Slovenia. So one of those is the project Valiant, which is the virtual exchange and professional networks for teachers, professors, and future teachers. So this would be student teachers. This is something that we have decided to become involved after the COVID period, especially because it was an interesting way to discuss with partners from different countries how to tackle the issue to, on one hand, motivate the unmotivated teacher. So how to get to those that either feel isolated due to their physical boundaries. So for example, let's say they're in a rural area, or on the other hand, those teachers that just can't seem to find the contact or how to get involved. So this was one of the areas we decided to get with the project, because at the ministry, what we try to do is we try to draw parallels from the mechanisms we try to implement on a national level. So this would be either national project, national guidelines, national frameworks, and we try to complement them with Erasmus Plus or other international projects. But the goal is to complement these two. And as we have already heard before from the evidence-based policymaking or evidence-informed policymaking, is this sort of strengthens our knowledge about especially what is going on in the field, if I may say so. So what do this way, through the Erasmus Plus projects, we enter through a different doorway into the schools and work with the teachers, and through the process of working with them, because we are very much involved in, so we are in the Valiant project, and then we are now currently very much involved in the AI for T project. So this is artificial intelligence for and by teachers. And I'm quite sure, as all of you are aware, with the ChatGPT and other open AI tools and platforms, this is a very, very hot topic. And this way we are sort of directly plugged in, not only from the policy making or from the policy point of view, but actually through working with the schools on a concrete project, making sure that we will get some concrete recommendations also for us. And then we are also participating on a couple of new other projects. Some have already been completed. But this is an activity we've been doing at the ministry now for, I think, more than 12 years. So it is something that we have managed to include very well in the ongoing regular work of the ministry, quite a number of my colleagues are involved. And this way, because we also are an active member in different work packages of the projects, not only we strengthen our knowledge on different topics, let's say from the topic point of view, so artificial intelligence in teaching, for example, or what are the benefits of virtual exchanges among teachers and professors, but at the same time, we get to contribute and compose together recommendations for other policymakers. So the partners from other countries that invite us into these projects are very much appreciate our point of view in regards to how to reach the policymaker. So we've had quite a number in Valiat. I know there are also colleagues from Germany. We have partners from Germany, and we have very interesting discussions, especially among us policymakers, or let's say ministerial entities as such, especially discussing on who is the right target audience between the policymakers. So is that somebody that works specifically and in direct correlation with the schools or has communication with them? Or is it something that we need to present to the minister, for example? Or should, if I may say so, skip the minister and address somebody else who is maybe in charge of a specific unit working with primary school, with secondary schools. So these are all of the issues that we that we have managed, and we have seen that it's very successful. It can be done very well through the Erasmus Plus projects. And at the same time, our colleagues, myself and everybody else, we get to meet excellent people. We get to have a discussion of peer-to-peer level. So this is excellent experience. And at the same time, we see what we have managed to implement well in the Slovenian system, where we maybe, let's say, excel, or where we are actually lagging behind far. And we get to compare, and we get to see good practices. We get to exchange them, and to a certain level, we discuss on how we can translate them into our education system. So I hope I've answered your question.
You definitely have. Thank you for illustrating how it really also is an opportunity for the public authorities involved to further their collaboration and their knowledge. When we look at it from like the other side, like the researcher side, Ulrike, I would like to ask you, as you have been involved in several such projects, TrainDL no less, what is your perspective on the setup between academia and public authorities collaborating? And do you have any advice for researchers considering to enter such a project?
Yeah, thank you. Indeed, it was a really interesting field for me to study, to do my research in. As you mentioned, I have been involved in several of such projects, both in the priority field of digital transformation. So I expected it to be rather similar, to do some copy and paste of research methodology, for instance, but indeed it did not work. So this is my message to other researchers. Please be aware that all of these projects are very distinct, and you have to definitely adapt your methodology between the projects. So for instance, just to compare OpenU, which was mentioned before, and TrainDL, which we are working now on, both in the field of more or less higher education and digital transformation. OpenU dealt with virtual mobility and how to use digital tools for student and teacher exchange, while TrainDL now is on digital literacy and teacher training. And we had a completely different situation here. So in both projects, we had to interview policymakers. We had to interview or to make surveys with local stakeholders in universities, with educators, trainers, trainees, and so on, to just find out which policies are in place, what are the intentions of policymakers, or how effective are policies, which recommendations can be drawn. The overall frame was completely the same, but the field within the frame completely different. So in OpenU, we had to recognize that there was almost no policy awareness within universities for the field of virtual exchange. So we could not even detect how effective policies are, because they simply weren't recognized and have not been implemented. So what we found out in our interviews and questionnaires was to I would say, different levels of familiarity or you could say kind of a pipeline leakage and transformation of European policies to national policies, to regional and local policies, and down to local strategies, implementations, regulations, and so on. And we could easily find out in which step of that transformation the policy awareness was decreasing. So in turn, the recommendations we could derive from this was rather on, I would say, communication and implementation issues. So we could not say if the policy itself was effective, but if it was effectively communicated, which is a quite different thing. And now in TrainDL, it's really a different picture. We have a really high policy awareness from higher authorities down to the smallest student teacher, who is really, really well aware of every policy that has ever been written on that topic. And we can really do experimentations, interventions, evaluations with all those group of stakeholders I mentioned before. And now we can evaluate the effectiveness of the policies themselves. We can derive recommendations on those regulations themselves, which is really completely different. So that's my key message. It's never the same.
That is, I think, also kind of nicely alludes to what Johannes presented in the beginning. So, Johannes, maybe you could elaborate. So if we frame these processes and then these outcomes of the projects or different policy or evidence-informed policymaking projects as an accelerator for positive change, which might be something that we feel might happen, but what could be indicators to assess change and sustainability? And are there good practices and knowledge communities that you can point us to?
Yeah, that's quite a broad question. I try to maybe focus on one or two points because it's really a large field, isn't it? I think one of the main merits of evidence-based policy making is this focus on a conceptual theory of change. That it really forces you to conceptualize how you think your intervention or policy will work. Right? What are the mechanisms of how we do something, and then what are the outputs, what are the outcomes, and to what impact will that lead? And I think this conceptualization of a program is already something that often is not done. Right? So this first step already without the evaluation, I think is very valuable. And then when you have conceptualized these mechanisms, you can start to test the individual mechanisms and can see maybe where you have holes in your theory, or where it doesn't work out in the real world as it is conceptualized. And that's the point where you can start improving on the policy itself, on the delivery, on the training, how to implement a policy, right? That's often a point where policies fail, or maybe you do an evaluation and you detect no effect. That often doesn't mean that there's no effect of the policy, but maybe it was implemented wrong, right, on different levels. So yeah, I would say strong concept of what you're trying to do, and then identifying the links in these mechanisms that can be improved, and that's how you improve your policy and your delivery. And in the extreme case, right, an evaluation can tell you that the policy doesn't work at all, or the intervention doesn't work at all, and you have to try something different. Maybe you have even adverse effects, right? That's where policy evaluation can also be very valuable to detect where you actually do the opposite of what you intended to do.
That's a super interesting point. Maybe I can, that is probably also not easy to answer, but I think from people who do project work, success is kind of an idea that is not linked to you finding out that your hypothesis was wrong or that something doesn't work at all. Have you seen that how this can be communicated to stakeholders then in this positive framing that you just presented to us?
I think it's a lot about the mindset of why you do evidence-based policymaking, right? If you implement a policy and then you evaluate it 3 years later, and then you say, okay, it worked or didn't work, that's not, I think, like the main idea. I think that it would be better to evaluate continuously and have this mindset of, okay, we're continuously evaluating, and then we can improve it over time. I might have a little bit of a bias from the UK, where like a lot of where like my ideas were shaped about evidence-based policymaking, and they really take that seriously, right? For example, there's this intervention in the UK now that was started during Corona on tutoring. So tutors in schools, so that pupils, especially from disadvantaged families that have to work from home, that they get some extra tutoring, right? And that's something they evaluated after the first year already. They got recommendations on how to improve it, and now they're 2 years later they're doing the next evaluation, and I think that's very powerful. This mindset of, okay, we are continuously evaluating, we're continuously improving. That's very important.
All right. Yeah, that is definitely something that is understandable. Frame it like that. Kathrin, maybe over to you with your insight into the different projects and also the bigger strategic frame of the European Union. Have you seen success factors in terms of impact that you see working across different thematic areas or different project setups to make outcomes more impactful? If you have concrete examples, I think everyone would be interested to hear those. Or is it, as Ulrike said, that the different projects, even if they are roughly in the same theme, might be so different that it can't be determined what the setup success factors are? Maybe you could speak on that for a bit.
Yes, sure. Thank you very much for this good question. And I totally agree with Ulrike. It really depends on the project consortium size, because we already saw, for example, the NEWT project had like 15 partners in the project. So it's really a huge project consortium. And also the fact that there are so many higher education, the ministries or public authorities also in the project consortium, that's really a whole another dimension. And for example, we had last year, or at the end of the Erasmus Plus program period, we conducted an evaluation survey, and especially on Erasmus Plus cooperation projects. And the evaluation showed that project representatives appreciate the implementation of innovative and application-oriented projects, and also the interdisciplinary work. And they also highlighted the combination of research and teaching. And what was really interesting about this evaluation was that it showed that the Erasmus Plus projects could generate a societal and political impact. Yeah, by the way, the label funded by the Erasmus Plus program was also highlighted as prestige factor. And the key action 3 generally was seen with key action 3, a higher reputation was associated. So we could see in this evaluation that policy experimentations really can change something. And also there was another evaluation of the Erasmus Plus program in 2017. And this one came to the conclusion, I quote, "At system level, where individual projects succeed in influencing policy system, the change is long lasting." So there are several evaluations which show that there is indeed a potential for change.
Thank you for sharing these concrete examples as well, and the evaluation outcomes, because that ties into my next point, which became quite apparent in preparing for today and with talking to all of you, which is that well-designed projects and their results can probably maybe only create the intended impact if the institutions in power are willing to receive them or are actually super involved and have an identification point. And Petra, you already alluded to that in Slovenia right now, there is a lot of openness to be part in these experimentations and to also take into account the findings. But maybe you can share your experience over the years. Has this changed? What were the factors for change? Do we have to also take into account different administrations, different political actors who are more or less open?
Actually, all of the above. Yes, it is, as you have explained. I mean, as you have nicely stated it. The thing is, we have now been involved, like I already mentioned, for numerous years in all of these projects. But the thing is, it depends on the topic that is, of course, in question. We always have issues, if I now change, maybe just for this segment, with dealing with schools, especially now after the COVID periods. Teachers are very occupied and the principals do have a different kind of attitude, and we try to stimulate them. We have this national mechanisms where we can give them, so we call them points for their continuous development and career advancement. So we have some sort of a mechanism to get them involved. But from the side of a point of the ministry, what we try to do very often is, of course, to ensure that from the point of view of Slovenia, we are not the only one involved. So we are always entering into partnerships where we have colleagues from either other national educational institutions, not only schools or universities, faculties that are participating, but also from different institutions, for example, from the National Educational Institute. Then they try to, that is a very strong mechanism and a very strong correlation. We've worked with them within our project ATS STEM, so that is assessment of transversal skills in STEM. We work together for, I mean, we always work together, but within this project, we worked with them for 3 years. They were in charge of the implementation in regards and working with schools, and they were very successful with it. We had a wonderful manager from the side of the institute. We were the work package leader for the dissemination and upscaling. So even from that correlation, we tried to maximize the output. But then, of course, with the collaboration, with the communication, we've actually prepared quite numerous recommendations in regards to the assessment of transversal skills in STEM. This was a project that was implemented during the COVID period. So the project just started, and then everything sort of went into closure, and the schools needed to implement the project while being closed and working online, which was sort of like an interesting push from the point of view of the project, because we were assessing we were evaluating, we were monitoring how do teachers use tools, online tools, to assess, to follow up students in the classroom on different tasks. So this was actually a outside push and made teachers even more aware. So we got excellent feedback in regards to numbers, in regards to participants from the teachers' parts, and of course from the pupils attending and being involved in the project. But what we actually have now numerous recommendations from that. We have gained insight, and we have now 3 concrete publications that we offer to our teachers on how to. So the first, for example, recommendation, the first publication is aimed on the generics. So what was the framework? What were the tools used? How everything worked on the national and international level? And then the second 2 publications are concrete examples on how to, from the sustainability goals, how to include them, how to work in interdisciplinary teams, how and which tools to use to evaluate and to monitor. This is something that, for example, for us as a ministry, not being, especially us coming from the digital education unit, for us, this has now been a very valuable insight from the field, from working with the institute and at the same time working with the schools, that we are now, because we have, like all of us, we have a lot of funds from the Resilience and Recovery Fund, and we are planning for new projects, and we use all of our Erasmus projects as a think tank. So what has been done? What have been the good examples? How can we prepare a new project, and of course, open it to other participants to build on the experience and gained practices? So how do we go from there on? And us being directly involved in the projects, not only from the content side, it also enables us to prepare better projects. Because now, of course, we are in the position of putting together a call, addressing all of these issues, thinking about how will we make sure that they think about the impact? How will we make sure that they prepare the recommendations well? What are the good elements? What are the most important elements about a good partnership? Who can be the coordinator? Who do we want to be the coordinator? So all of these elements have been are crystallized more because we are involved so much in the Erasmus Plus projects. So this is something that we have managed to sort of translate from our participation in all of these projects, a successful implementation, and from the partnerships.
It's really interesting to think about how you kind of created a culture where the political will might change or outside factors might change, but it's already so established. Johannes, you also alluded to the UK, where this also seems to be the case. Maybe you can draw a bit of a comparison between the UK and Germany, maybe other countries that you have knowledge on, why, according to you, it might be different in different administrations or different political cultures, and how to maybe address public authorities in countries that are less agile maybe or less open to it.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I don't have done any academic work on like the comparison of evidence-based policymaking in different countries. But I think in the UK, this idea of evidence-based policymaking came in this area of new public management, and I think in the US under Bill Clinton and then Tony Blair in the UK, it was implemented to another degree than in Germany, right? We had it here under Schröder as well, but this idea of new public management and measuring outcomes was very, very strong in the UK, and they have excellent collaborations with universities. With my alma mater, University of Oxford, we have this department for evidence-based social intervention and policy evaluation, and there's a really strong partnership between the universities and the government, and already in like the planning phase of policies, and that might be a contributing factor. But I also don't want to speculate too much on like where if there's like a big mindset difference or something like that.
And have you experienced in addressing different public actors, how they can gain openness if informed correctly, or how would you approach maybe a country or a Bundesland in Germany that is hesitant but interested to maybe join?
I feel like right now the focus is not so much, at least I don't recognize it that much, on evidence-based policymaking. Like something that's gaining more traction is like data-driven policymaking. It's like this, I think that a lot of actors now recognize that you need like some data, some insights into the challenges and problems you're dealing with. And they see this kind of like as a baseline, right? You need some data to know what's going on, and maybe this can be like a stepping stone into more evidence-based, evidence-informed policymaking. But yeah, those are not like directly there's not the same data-driven policymaking, I think, and evidence-based policymaking. We don't have this like experimentation focus, I think. But yeah, since COVID, I think when they saw, like, for example, that it's super hard to collect all the incidence numbers, for example, I think that was a lot of actors thinking differently about utilizing data and evidence now going forward.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Kathrin, Ulrike, from your points of view, when we think about political openness and how to address stakeholders, is there any gold nuggets you could share, or any calls to action?
Do you want to go ahead?
No, go ahead, please.
I don't know if it's a gold nugget, but at least it's a kind of remark. So I made different experiences with willingness, openness of political processes from my perspective of a researcher. So sometimes they have been asking open questions, and they have been really looking for answers. And in some other cases, I made the experience that they already felt their decisions, and they just wanted to legitimate them afterwards. And to be honest, it doesn't feel really good to be used only as some kind of such a fig leaf as a researcher. So that's turning me to just aim at providing evidence to inform political decisions. So the decision still has to be done on a political level, that's clear, but I really try to provide a basis for that. Yeah, it's not a gold nugget, I assume.
But I think it's an important point, because we've been talking a lot about the public side now, and of course the researchers are equally as important, and how they can best perform what they set out to do. Yeah. So when we talk about TrainDL, or maybe in more broad terms, digital education, bringing that back thematically, ChatGPT has already been mentioned. It's in everyone's lips. It's just the tip of the iceberg, and we can see right now that a lot of knowledge is needed, or a lot of data maybe is needed to understand how this influences the education sphere, how it influences assessment. And maybe to draw on a last point, or ask from you, maybe you, Kathrin, can go for it first on the level of Erasmus Plus programs, and maybe also in your personal opinion, what could be upcoming topics and approaches that should come forward in the area of digital education in the next months and years.
Yes, maybe just a small addition to what Ulrike said previously. For example, the NEWT project, which I mentioned before, they also involved education ministries from 5 European countries. And there the lessons learned were that already in the application process, they needed to check whether it could really be implemented, the measures in the different countries. So I think this was a lesson learned from this project. And they also worked in this project before they further developed their project in another project under the same funding line. So this might also be a hint for implementing another project. And to your question regarding the future programs, as I already said, there will be a next call for forward-looking projects this autumn. And there will be probably again also a priority on digital education. And in next year, there will be also probably another call of the European policy experimentations. So there are many possibilities, also because, as I already said, the digitalization is one of the main priorities of the Erasmus Plus program. So you can basically find funding lines, different funding lines, and maybe one topic that maybe fostered in the future is micro-credentials, which has also several links with digitalization. Yes.
Wonderful, thank you. And Ulrike, based on where we are in the project right now, maybe now is a good moment to talk about that a bit more concretely. From the findings we already have in TrainDL and from your work on digital education topics that you also do in the German Informatics Society quite extensively, in what areas does digital education policy need a boost in the next months and years, and what can maybe we provide from the project?
Maybe one topic could be this awareness issue I mentioned in the beginning. So what I've seen in different situations, not only in this policy experimentation projects, but also in different other projects, is that there is, I would say, limited awareness of people regarding the benefits of regulations and standards and so on as a necessary basis for interoperability. So if you just consider the European Union, we have several cooperating nations, states, or if you consider digitalization as a topic, we have cooperating tools and people and so on. So in all of these cases, we need to cooperate, to communicate and so on. We need regulations, we need standards as a basis for that. It's still necessary. But I always recognize people not wanting policies on the one hand and asking for policies on the other hand. So I see many people crying, they should regulate this AI, for instance. And one moment later, I don't want to follow their rules. Or in the technical discussions, people asking to access all these tools, and I want to integrate it in my desktop, blah, 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 blah. And 10 minutes later, I just follow my own standards. So it's kind of mad. And I think we need to raise awareness why regulations are necessary, why standards are necessary, and do some kind of, I would say, broader outreach of political education. You could say it's also technical education to create this awareness that we need such aspects if we want to do digitalization or globalization or whatever you will call it, cooperation. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing. And I think in TrainDL we also, as we operate, just tying it to what you just said, we're operating on the assumption, or one of our hypotheses is that we are testing, is that well-founded digital education means it needs to be actually like technically well-founded, and then how to give those skills and competences to people who don't understand themselves as computer science teachers or STEM teachers, and kind of see where that leads us. But Petra, your hand is raised, so please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to connect to what Ulrike was saying. So the thing is, I can imagine Germany is big. For Slovenia is small. So for us, the cooperation and the guidelines and the recommendations from the European Commission do offer us some sort of a framework, which I suppose for us is easier to translate, easier. I completely agree. We have the same issues with everybody would like to have recommendations and guidelines, but then when we offer them, the question is always, how do we do this? What do you want from us? And things like that. So, but I think that's quite common in speaking in this context. But for us, I think just thinking you talk about I think for us, for Slovenia, this is one of the elements we really we need to take into consideration. We need to be aware of that. We're quite small. Slovenia has a bit over 2 million inhabitants. So, and the system, if it weren't for these international cooperations, either on policy level or on school level or on various levels of education, it's sort of for us, it's like bringing in new winds, new air, new ideas, new practices. It's making sure that there is there is coming to an exchange of all of these things that are very strictly necessary for growth and development of a system, of an educational system that we all know that takes quite a lot of time if you want to do even the smallest of changes, especially now in the correlation, for example, with the changes in AI and the ChatGPT. We cannot react as fast as we would like to change the curriculum. It is impossible. So there must be other mechanisms, and through these cooperation mechanisms, some of these changes, and I wouldn't even call them changes, just sort of like accommodations to the current trends and to the happenings in the education system can be done swiftly, more swiftly for us, for example, and at the same time include a different kind of a perspective that we would be otherwise able to do by ourselves. Maybe just going on that note. So.
Thank you, Petra. I think that is a wonderful note to end on, kind of this highlighting how we can all benefit if we support each other and kind of, open up the processes as things keep moving faster and faster and the disruptions are coming at us. And as we're also nearing our event time-wise, I would like to thank all of you. It was a really insightful conversation. It definitely gave me some new perspectives, and I hope our participants and everyone listening to the recording afterwards has a similar experience. Approaches to policy experimentation actually have been a super steep learning curve for us in the project. And the more information and concrete examples are out there and accessible, the easier it gets to envision and put into action, not only for us in TrainDL, but also everyone who comes after. And as I said in the beginning, you can find the TrainDL outcomes, and they will keep coming up in the next few months more intensely also as we are drawing near the end of the project on train-dl.eu. And all the options to get in touch with us and stay informed are on there as well. So with that, I would like to close. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.